Some moments change everything, even when you don't see it coming. That morning, as sunlight trickled through the blinds of our shared apartment, I didn't realize the line between friendship and something far more dangerous was about to blur. I lived with David, my roommate and closest friend, and we'd shared that tiny two-bedroom for over a year. It was an arrangement born out of convenience, but somewhere along the way, a bond one couldn't quite define had formed. I remember how ordinary it all felt at first. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my half-empty cup of coffee, thoughts of my boyfriend, Jake, drifting through my mind. Jake lived 2 cities over, and our long-distance relationship was steady, reliable. We were good together, even if the spark of those first months had settled into something calmer. I found comfort in that. Love doesn't need fireworks all the time to feel real. David burst into the kitchen then, breaking my reverie. "Morning," he said, voice light but tinged with that teasing edge I'd grown accustomed to. He stood barefoot, shirtless, wearing sweatpants that hung just low enough to be a little careless. His presence was effortless, always filling a room as if he owned it. I noticed his messy curls, damp as if he'd just rinsed off his face. It was the kind of detail I shouldn't have been paying attention to, but lately, I'd been noticing everything about David. "Morning," I replied, forcing myself to look back at my coffee. David leaned on the counter, hands spread as he faced me. "You're quiet." That serious face again. "Thinking about Jake?" His tone was light, but something lingered in his eyes, something searching. I shrugged. "Just thinking about work?" A lie, of course, but I didn't want to entertain his teasing. David had a way of prying, slipping beneath the surface like water filling cracks. It was harmless, I told myself. He was just naturally playful, effortlessly charming, never with intention. "You work too much," David said, walking over to grab a banana. As he passed, his shoulder brushed mine. It wasn't unusual, just an accident, but it lingered a second too long. I ignored the way my skin prickled at the contact. David peeled his banana and plopped down across from me. His dark eyes met mine again, steady this time. "You need to loosen up, man. You're always so serious." I forced a chuckle. Someone has to be. The truth was, David and I couldn't have been more different. Where I was quiet, steady, and measured, David was unpredictable, living life on impulse. His friends loved him for it. People gravitated to him. I'd never envied him, exactly, but in moments like this, when his gaze lingered, when his smile tugged at one corner, I felt something I couldn't quite name. "So, Jake coming to visit soon?" David asked, his voice deceptively casual. "Next week," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "That's good. Bet you miss him?" "I do." The words came out flat, and David seemed to notice. He chewed thoughtfully, his gaze never wavering. "Must be tough," he said finally, "being apart so much." "It's worth it," I said too quickly. It sounded defensive even to me. I didn't know why I felt the need to justify it, especially to David. He wasn't challenging me, not really, but his words lingered in the air like smoke. David's smile returned, faint but unreadable. "Of course. You're the loyal type, after all." It sounded like a compliment, but something in the way he said it made me shift uncomfortably. Before I could respond, David pushed his chair back with a scrape and stood. "I'm gonna hop in the shower," he said, tossing the banana peel into the trash. "You should relax for once. The world's not going anywhere." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence. I stared into my coffee again, the ripples smoothing out as I let my mind wander. David's words stayed with me, though I tried to shake them off. Loyal. I'd always considered loyalty my strongest quality, something I could cling to when everything else felt uncertain. But why did it sound like a challenge coming from him? I sighed, pushing myself up from the table to clear my cup. It was just David being David, I told myself, pushing buttons, playing games. He never meant anything by it. But as I moved through the apartment, gathering my things for the day, I couldn't deny that something had shifted. It was small, imperceptible almost, like the first tremor before an earthquake. David's casual remarks, the way he looked at me, the lingering shoulder brush, all of it coalesced into something I couldn't ignore. I tried to remind myself of Jake, of steady, comforting Jake, but David's voice kept intruding, "You need to loosen up." By the time I heard the faint hum of water running from the bathroom, my nerves felt taut, like a wire stretched too far. I glanced toward the closed bathroom door as I passed, hearing the echo of David's movements beyond it. I paused for just a second, long enough to feel that prickle of heat, like I was standing too close to the sun. I forced myself to move on. It was nothing, I told myself again, heading back toward my room. Just David being David. Just me overthinking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible threshold, and there was no going back. The sound of running water seemed louder than it should have been, echoing down the short hallway of our apartment. I'd heard David step into the shower minutes earlier, humming some tune I couldn't place. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to focus on the open book in my lap, but the words blurred together. My thoughts drifted back to the kitchen, to the way David had looked at me, playful, yet searching. It was a look I'd shrugged off too many times before, but today it lingered like a shadow. I told myself I was being ridiculous. David was my friend, my roommate, nothing more. And yet the edges of my mind felt frayed, my defenses thin. I rubbed the back of my neck, the steam from the shower creeping into the hallway, clinging to the apartment like a heavy mist. Then it happened. "Hey, Trump." David's voice carried through the partially open bathroom door, clear despite the rush of water. My stomach turned. "What?" I called back, my voice more defensive than I intended. "You got a sec? Come here for a minute." I froze, my book forgotten. "What do you need?" "Just come here," he said, laughing lightly, like this was a joke I was somehow missing. "I promise it's nothing serious." I hesitated, staring at the half-closed door at the end of the hall. The voice inside me, reasonable, logical, told me to stay put. There was no reason to go. But there was another voice too, quieter, pulling at me. I told myself it was curiosity, though I knew better. I stood up before I could think too hard about it. My feet carried me to the bathroom door, and I knocked lightly. "What?" I asked again, my voice low. David's laughter came again, muffled through the water and the door. "Just come in. You're so uptight, man." "Why?" I said, though my hand was already on the door handle. "Relax, will you? It's not like I'm naked," he teased. I hesitated for a beat longer, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, against all better judgment, I pushed the door open just enough to step inside. The room was warm, humid, the mirror completely fogged over. The sound of the water was louder here, filling the small space. I kept my eyes trained on the floor, the tiles damp beneath my socks. I didn't look toward the shower, didn't let myself see the outline of David through the frosted glass. "You called?" I said, forcing a casual tone. David laughed again, softer this time. "You're so serious, Trump. Always so tense." There was a pause before he added, "Lighten up a little, will you?" I swallowed hard. My pulse was quick, like I'd been running. "Is that all you wanted? To lecture me?" There was a shift in the water, like David had moved. I kept my gaze fixed on the foggy mirror. "You know," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make my stomach flip, "you never let yourself feel anything, do you?" "Not really." "David." "I mean it," he interrupted, his voice steady but teasing. "You've got everything so locked up. Don't you ever want to let go?" I exhaled sharply, nerves crawling up my spine. The steam seemed thicker now, heavy in my lungs. My mind raced for something to say, something to break the tension, but every word felt inadequate. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" David replied, almost whispering now. I hated how easily he got to me, how his words seeped into cracks I didn't know existed. I hated the heat building in my chest, the sense that I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. My boyfriend's face flashed in my mind, Jake, steady and kind, and guilt rose up to meet the rest of it. "David, I'm leaving," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed me, too shaky to carry the weight of conviction. The water shut off abruptly. Silence swallowed the room, broken only by the soft drip of water and my uneven breathing. "Suit yourself," David said finally, his voice light, almost indifferent. I heard him pull back the glass door slightly, the sound sharp and sudden. "But you don't have to keep running, you know." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I turned sharply, pulling the door open and stepping back into the hallway. I didn't look at him, not once. I couldn't. The air outside the bathroom felt cold against my damp skin, my mind spinning as I retreated to my room. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as if I could physically hold back whatever had just happened. My hands were trembling. My thoughts were a mess, guilt, anger, confusion, all swirling together in a haze. I knew what David had been doing, the line he'd been testing. And I knew I'd let him. I dropped onto the edge of my bed, my head in my hands. Jake's name echoed in my mind like a lifeline, but it couldn't drown out David's voice, soft and teasing. "Don't you ever want to let go?" I wished I could forget that moment, wash it away like the steam in the bathroom. But it clung to me, impossible to shake, and I knew something between us had shifted. And there was no going back. The apartment was quieter than I'd ever heard it, but the silence felt thick, unnatural. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, still feeling the steam-soaked heat clinging to my skin. My heart hadn't settled since I left the bathroom. Every breath I took felt tight in my chest, like my ribs were fighting to keep me from breaking open. I wanted to shake it off, David's voice, the words he said, the way he felt so sure of himself when I wasn't. But no matter how much I tried to bury it, I kept hearing him. "Don't you ever want to let go?" That single question echoed in my mind, unrelenting. A knock at the door jolted me upright. "Trump." David's voice was quieter now, almost hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should be here. I stared at the door, hands clenched into fists against my knees. My instinct was to ignore him, to leave this mess sitting between us unsaid, unacknowledged. But I couldn't. "Yeah," I replied, my voice betraying me with its lack of strength. The door opened slowly, just enough for David to lean in, his curls damp, a towel draped around his shoulders. He looked at me, not smug, not teasing, just calm, almost careful. He stepped inside and shut the door softly behind him. "Can we talk?" he asked. I shrugged, my throat tight. "About what?" David sat on the edge of the bed across from me, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together. He looked at me for a long time, and I couldn't meet his gaze. "You're mad," he said finally. "I'm not mad," I replied too quickly, the words sharp and cutting. "You are," he insisted, but his tone wasn't defensive. "And that's fine. You should be." I pushed too far. I looked up at him then, surprised. David rarely admitted to overstepping. He was the type to laugh off consequences, to charm his way through any uncomfortable moment. But here he was, looking at me without a hint of playfulness. "You didn't push me," I said quietly. David tilted his head, studying me. "Then what's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I laughed bitterly. "David, do you even hear yourself? Do you realize what you're doing?" I stopped, the words catching in my throat. "You know I have a boyfriend?" He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. "Yeah, I know." "Then why?" David didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands as though searching for the right words. "I don't know, Trump," he admitted, his voice soft. "Maybe I just wanted to see where the line was." "The line?" I snapped, anger rising like a sudden flame. "The line's right there, David. It's been there the whole time." David met my eyes then, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that I couldn't place. Regret, maybe, or something close to it. "I didn't mean to make this complicated," he said quietly. "But you can't deny it. Something's there, isn't it?" I stood abruptly, turning away from him. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning. "It doesn't matter what's there," I said firmly. I love Jake. I know you do, David said softly. But that doesn't mean it's easy, does it? His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I turned back toward him, my hands trembling at my sides. What do you want from me, David? What am I supposed to say? Nothing, he said quickly, standing now, his tone almost urgent. I don't want anything from you. He stopped, running a hand through his damp curls. I don't know. I've been trying to ignore it, but it's been there for a while. I shouldn't have said anything. I shouldn't have done what I did. Silence fell between us again, heavy and suffocating. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice hoarse. We can't do this. David nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I get it. He stepped toward the door, his movements quieter now, his confidence drained. Before he left, he paused. I'm sorry, Trump. For everything. And then he was gone. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my head in my hands. The weight of it all pressed down on me. The guilt, the confusion, the ache I couldn't name. I thought of Jake, steady and kind, and how much he trusted me. The thought nearly broke me. It would have been easy, too easy, to fall into something with David. To let go, just as he'd said. But love isn't supposed to be easy. Love is a choice, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I picked up my phone, staring at Jake's name on the screen. I thought about the life we'd built together, even if it wasn't perfect. I thought about the promises we'd made, and how loyalty wasn't just a word but an action, something you fight for even when it's hard. I dialed his number, my fingers steady. As the phone rang, I felt something shift inside me, resolve, clarity. I couldn't erase what had happened, couldn't deny the temptation that lingered like smoke in the air. But I wouldn't let it consume me. Hey, Jake, I said softly when he answered. Hey, he replied, his voice warm and familiar. Everything okay? I swallowed hard, my chest easing for the first time all day. Yeah, I said. I wanted to hear your voice. And maybe that's what love really is. Choosing the person who feels like home, even when the world tries to pull you in every other direction.